Okay, then we have someone online, I think. So Johannes is... Oh, yeah, he's online, yeah. Hi, yeah, okay, great. So welcome here online at the symposium that accompanies the inaugural lecture of Mariette. And Mariette told me, this is Johannes Katsarov, and Mariette told me that you are a highly valued colleague of her on the Integrity Project. And Johannes is a games researcher at the Ljubljana University at Lüneburg. Is that a good pronunciation? Yeah? Lüneburg, okay, in Germany. Where he develops digital games to sensitize people for chances and risks associated with new technology. Previously, he worked at the University of Zurich, where he conducted research on the promotion of moral sensitivity. He just submitted a doctoral dissertation. Is that correct still, or is it already accepted?
It's accepted. It just needs to be published.
Okay, great. Congratulations. Okay. So his principal research interest is into identify teaching mechanisms and strategies that effectively facilitate the development of responsible attitudes and competences for moral agency. So thanks for coming online, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been focus on what works in research integrity education. They had checked more than 4,000 studies, including unpublished research. They had used quantitative and qualitative methods, which were triangulated. They had included more than 200 variables looking at these diverse studies, which were coded by 3 different raters, and they found indicative evidence on supportive factors and detrimental factors for as many as 77 different factors which they looked at. So we had to ask ourselves very critically, if this was in 2019, is there anything relevant and new that we can even offer with this project? However, when we scrutinized these studies, we noticed that they had a few methodological limitations, which are pretty stark, actually. The first of them is the assumed independence of variables. So each variable, this means, is treated as an independent feature of a course that does not interact with other features. And I'll give you an example in a moment. The idea is you have a general effect size of a course. For example, how much knowledge learners developed in between the beginning of the course and the end of the course. And then you look at, so how long was the course, for example? That could be variable A. And you want to see, essentially, is there a correlation between the length of courses and the learning effects? And you do that for 77 different variables, and you get different kinds of medium effect sizes. There you find, are there factors that distinguish highly effective courses from courses that are not effective at all? And this is precisely what they did in these studies. This was the core of their work. The problem, however, is that variables can correlate very highly, and that high or low effect predictions may be due to chance or the influence of other factors, what we call in statistics spurious correlations, for example. Also, factors may need to come in combinations. That means maybe in some studies we're just seeing good combinations when things work, but the other studies that have done the contrary haven't been conducted or published. And I'll give you an example from one of these studies here. They found, for example, here at the top left, that the course hours, if it was a course of less than 8 hours, you had a standard effect size of 0.61, which is a medium effect size. That's quite impressive, actually. Between 8 and 16 hours was also medium, but then you see courses that lasted more than 16 hours had a standard effect size of only 0.39, which is significantly lower. This could lead to the conclusion that shorter courses in ethics education or in research integrity education are better. However, what we also see here is that they are actually looking at very different outcomes of learning. For example, the skill to reason about ethical problems, or what is called knowledge here. Moral reasoning is in the Piagetian or Kohlbergian tradition is a very slowly developing ability to view and discuss ethical problems from a principled point of view instead of from an egotistical point of view, or just by what is conventionally accepted in your cultural context. Knowledge, on the other hand, pertains to some stuff like, for example, knowing a code of conduct and being able to reproduce it. So these are completely different things. And what we see here is, on average, all of the courses in the sample that they had in their study only achieved 0.39 standard effect size in the development of moral reasoning, but almost twice the amount, or exactly twice the amount, in terms of gains for knowledge. The question here is, what if a large proportion of the long courses assess the development of moral reasoning? Or what if short courses and experiments try to stimulate the development of knowledge more often than longer courses? So we could have a spurious correlation here, where what we saw before, these time effects, are actually explained by the measurement of different things. And I would say comparing apples with pears. This is the second methodological limitation of these reviews. They basically confounded all kinds of different variables, treated all effect size equally independent of what has been learned, whether it was moral reasoning or knowledge or ethical awareness. All of these different things were just lumped together and analyzed as if they were the same thing. The underlying assumption is, of course, a method that promotes one kind of ethical education or learning will also promote all other kinds of learning. But that's wrong. We know from empirical research that courses that succeeded in promoting ethical sensitivity regularly failed to increase moral reasoning, and vice versa. We also have seen several studies that have found that moral sensitivity and moral reasoning hardly correlate with another or do not correlate at all. So there are different ethical abilities, and if you're better or worse in these abilities, doesn't say very much about whether you're good at the other tasks and challenges. And what kind of knowledge you have about ethics usually doesn't tell you very much either. So what we see here is really a big problem, and it reduces the confidence that we can have in these kinds of studies. So what have we done differently? In our method, we surveyed more than 1,500 articles and originally selected 30 studies that met our inclusion criteria that needed to be empirical and use and at least have a comparison of two groups or a before-after comparison of learning. And we didn't allow for any self-evaluation scores because it has been shown that self-assessment of learners is not correlated with actual learning. We also pre-registered 12 hypotheses that were based on the findings of prior systematic reviews. So instead of just an explorative analysis, we wanted to test very concrete, theoretically based ideas about what could work and should work. And then we didn't only conduct a moderator analysis, which is what I just showed you before, but we also used a meta-regression analysis. And I'll say more about that in a second. Our first methodological innovation was that we separately analyzed different learning outcomes. On the one hand, we looked at what stimulated knowledge about research integrity or responsible conduct of research. Then we looked at what stimulates moral judgment or moral reasoning competence. And then where you had to pile three different abilities together due to a lack of data. And that was what we called moral orientation. That's a summary of moral attitudes, sensitivity, and behaviors. But we only analyzed these with moderator analyses and otherwise used this to test hypotheses whether it's actually true that that different learning outcomes necessitate different kinds of interventions. We also simultaneously controlled multiple factors by a meta-regression analysis. So what we did was we checked whether 20 potential factors that we investigated influenced the learning outcomes, so the standard effect sizes, when they were all considered at the same time. We tested these 12 hypotheses that we had developed in this method and considered also 10 quality aspects of the studies, for example, whether they were published in a peer-reviewed journal or whether we found mistakes in the studies, these kinds of things. And we developed the best models for each learning outcomes. That means a model of different variables, which together explain as much of the variance in between the studies as possible, with as few input variables as necessary. So this is also what characterizes a good theory. You don't want to say, well, there are 30 different things that may matter, but you want to know, are there really like 3 or 4 factors that you need to control? Our our findings are of course more wide than I can discuss right now, but our key findings were overall that experiential learning approaches were more effective than classical case discussions. And these classical case discussions, as all of you will know, are generally viewed kind of as the gold standard of ethics education. This is what most people do. A personal engagement, for example, imagining how to deal with a challenging situation or role play, was highly effective in general, and discussing the emotional dimensions of ethical decision making. The average effects that we had for these kinds of studies were significantly higher than for all others. And this was a factor that we found across the development of knowledge, across the development of judgmental competence, and all the other factors as well. What we also saw is that different goals of RCR training, or responsible conduct of research training, benefit from different approaches. For example, applying codes of conduct to cases appears to promote knowledge acquisition. However, not covering codes of conducts appeared to benefit the achievement of other learning outcomes. So on average, what we saw, for example, was that it seemed to be detrimental to attitudinal learning to discuss codes of conduct with students. However, it helped in the development of knowledge. Unfortunately, we won't have much time to discuss why this could be the case today. But if you're interested, we can always discuss this, and you can always have a look at the paper. Additionally, we found that several key factors identified in previous meta-studies could not be validated. For example, courses offered to learners across several disciplines were not affected negatively. This had been a core finding of some of the previous studies. They believed that if you have highly mixed groups, then that's bad for the courses. Also, we didn't find that blended learning really increased the effectiveness of the courses overall. What we saw, for instance, was that when students studied on their own at home, read texts, and filled out things online, that was very helpful. This kind of individual learning was very helpful for the development of their knowledge, but not for the rest. So for the development of the other competences, it appeared that we needed much more of this experiential learning, and that individualized learning didn't matter so much. So that's my presentation. I need to really leave in a couple of minutes, but I have time for one or two questions if you like. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you still have time for one or two short questions? You are sure?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Are there questions? There are no questions. Are there questions online?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, there is a question. Julia has a question.
So, hello, I'm Julia from Key University. So my question is, I find it really interesting, and I know the paper. I read it, I think, a few times. My question is, how did you actually collect the data? In a sense of, for example, you said that you combined moral sensitivity, moral habitus, or moral attitudes, and so on. So how did you decide which data goes in which pot?
So that was, first of all, theoretically founded. So based on what is the theory of moral judgment development, for instance, then we always had to look at what is it actually that the authors of a study say they are doing, but then also what is it actually that they are testing. So sometimes you find people, they say, we're developing ethical sensitivity. But then you look at their measures and their scores and the tests that they gave to students, and you see, actually, they're just asking people about their attitudes towards different subjects. So in that kind of a case, we scored this as a measure of moral attitude development and not of moral sensitivity, because moral sensitivity tests would need to meet the criterion that that people are actually capable of identifying ethical issues or problems, and that needs to be tested for a study in our case to qualify as a test or a study of ethical sensitivity development. When we decided to group together several of these learning categories into the moral orientations thing, it was just because we had too few studies on the one hand, but that it was also interesting for us to compile the data. And too few studies in this case means we didn't have enough variance between the studies to see any kinds of differences that we could have analyzed statistically. But at the same time, what we also saw when we put them together, then we also saw we can't analyze this compilation with meta-regression analysis. It's just still insufficiently helpful data to work with. So let's just be honest and not do it. What we did, however, was that we also threw everything into one big pile and checked whether we find any interesting effects there. And we compared that with the single effects for knowledge and judgment development. And those were the ones essentially that we managed to keep apart from the rest.
There is one more short question. I hope he can keep it short.
I will keep it very short. First of all, my compliments with this major work, a really theoretical sound. I just one question. In the beginning you said shorter courses were better than longer courses, according to certain, let's say to certain meta reviews. Did you investigate that aspect also, and what did you find?
Yeah, interestingly, we investigated that aspect. We had expected that longer courses would be better if you distinguish by the different learning outcomes. And the only thing that we really found there when we threw everything together was that the very short courses of less than 5 hours were a bit weaker on average. But above that threshold, we didn't find big differences. The thing probably is that some short courses, like a game, for example, that you play for 1 hour, academical it's called, have much larger effects than many shorter courses, although they don't do anything else wrong or anything like that. So what we can see actually is that with very good methods, you can achieve a lot in very short time. So what we've also seen with a game that we developed at the University of Zurich was that we found large effect sizes on the change of ethical attitudes towards patients with a serious moral game that we developed, and that from only playing this game for like 1.5 hours. And these effects are larger than what we found in other studies where students were sitting in a course for a semester and read tons of papers and also did active casework and stuff like that. And so time doesn't seem to matter so much when you compare very different approaches. That's what I can tell from this at the moment. And it also shows us how much more we could achieve with better learning materials and approaches. So I thank you very much. I need to get running.
Thank you so much, Johannes. So run to your class. And a present is on its way to Germany. So thanks and good luck.
Thank you very much. You have a nice day. Bye.